Every week, Hillsdale College President Larry Arnn joins Hugh Hewitt to discuss great books, great men, and great ideas. This is Hillsdale Dialogues, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio.
Morning glory and evening grace, America. That music means that the Hillsdale Dialogue is about to begin. If you missed last week, you'll be a little bit surprised because Dr. Arnn is off doing commencement things at Hillsdale, but he lent us his magnificent dean of the Graduate School of Hillsdale's Graduate School of Statesmanship in Washington, D.C., from his library, his study full of American revolutionary texts, to give us a couple of weeks. We did part one last week, getting us up to about 1765. How did America come to be? Because the 250th anniversary of Lexington and Concord was 2 weeks ago in April, and here we are in May, Matt, and not a lot of people know that we've begun celebrating the term that I can't say, but it's our 250th birthday, and it really did begin on April 19th. I don't know what, it's not a centennial. What do we call it? Do you know the quincentennial?
Semi-quincentennial, which is why everyone now calls it America 250.
Okay, America 250. Biquincentennial, a mouthful. So we are celebrating our 250th. Matt, where we left off last week is that George III was the enforcer of an increasingly despotic attempt by Parliament to take control of the colony. Did America have any friends in Parliament at all?
Oh, they did, definitely. And I mentioned earlier Edmund Burke, the party of Burke, the Rockingham Whigs. Pitt, to some extent, was friendly to the Americans. There was some friendliness, and I think it could have gone a different direction. There were the hardcore elements of the Parliament were probably the majority. But it is true. What happened at a certain point is once the king in 1775, to jump ahead here a little bit, once he declares a rebellion and then he gives an opening to, he speaks at the opening of Parliament and takes a hard line and basically tells them he's going to settle this matter by sending over the military and alludes to the fact that he is hiring mercenaries. Once he does that, the hardliners in Parliament are completely in control. At that point, there's really no turning back.
Now, Matt, I have told for years my law students have had to watch the first two episodes of the magnificent HBO classic from 20 years ago, John Adams, starring Paul Giamatti, because it begins with the Boston Massacre in 1770, and it takes 3 or 4 hours to get up to the Declaration of Independence, because there's a lot of history in those 6 years, 1770 to 1776. What do you think is most important for people to know about that half decade?
Well, so we had left off. There's some taxes that the English are trying to pass, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act. That gets pulled back. They then come back and try to pass something called the Townshend Acts. Those get pulled back as well. But one thing I would want to mention is after the Stamp Act is withdrawn in 1766, the English Parliament passes something called the Declaratory Act. And any law student, everybody's interested, should go look it up. It's actually quite brief. And it basically encompasses and encapsulates everything about the British position, which is, they say, we're withdrawing the stamp tax, but we are doing so and reiterating and making clear and pronouncing to everyone and thus forward forever and ever, the American colonies are in all cases subject to our laws in all cases whatsoever. That's kind of the key point at which the Americans realize the game is up here.
Now, Matt, that's not unacceptable to some Americans right now. Earlier you mentioned there are preachers galore. The Americans are a religious people. There's a Jewish congregation in Newport, Rhode Island. There's one in Charleston, South Carolina. There are others. But it's primarily Christian. There's some Catholic and some Quakers and some other things. But most of these people are fairly mainstream Protestants. whether they're the Anglican variety in Virginia or the Puritan variety up north. What do their pastors and their leadership in the churches think about the declaratory acts?
Well, setting aside the particulars of the act, the general question is, what do they think about their responsibility to obey the king and the king and parliament? And that's really the debate, right? There's actually a fascinating debate really overlooked that goes on prior to the things we're talking about here. John Adams has a famous letter he writes later where he says, what was the real American Revolution? The American Revolution, the true American Revolution, occurred a long time before the war started, and that was a change in opinions and sentiments, mostly having to do with religious opinions. And the key shift that occurs, going back to those sermons in the 1760s especially, stemming from this debate over the Stamp Act and the Declaratory Act and what does all this mean, is the clergy have to think through the meaning, the biblical meaning of the Christian requirement or the Christian obligation to obey one's leader, one's governor, one's king. And they do so in a way that essentially causes a reinterpretation, if you will, of a whole biblical tradition, which is they start making the argument that, yes, our job is to obey legitimate leadership. The Bible says doesn't say anywhere we are to obey tyrants. And they essentially start making and bringing into their sermons what essentially is, on its surface, a Lockean argument, but more importantly, a natural law argument, going back to those Greeks and Romans, about how we have obligations to nature, to justice, and to God that are separate from our obligations to the king.
Do these pastors identify themselves as revolutionaries, or do they think of themselves as theologians?
They really do think of themselves as theologians. I mean, there are debates in the American founding. There are some that are more, I suppose, friendly to the independence movement, but they don't necessarily identify themselves as such. They see this as an obligation on their part as pastors, as interpreters and teachers of the biblical truth to their congregations, to help them think this through. And there's just this massive movement to do so, and they change in this, which is why by the time you get to the American Revolution, the pastors of all the different pastors, every congregation, every Protestant congregation, in the Catholic pamphlets as well, they all support the revolution. There's a split off in the loyal Anglican Church of the loyalists, but it's actually quite small when you put it in the larger scheme of things. And the revolution is not caused by those sermons, it's not caused by the religious, but I think it's very clear that the revolution would not have succeeded. It would have not continued had not those sermons and those pastors.
And I want to make it's ecumenical. You end up going from hardcore atheists like Thomas Paine to pseudo-deist Ben Franklin to deist Thomas Jefferson to fairly mainstream Protestant Presbyterian right out of Princeton from Pastor Witherspoon, James Madison, to Harvard divinity student, because everyone was a divinity student, John Adams. And then you end up, of course, with I don't know what you would call the ultramontane. Who's the most conservative firebrand of them all? I'm not sure who is, but they went to school somewhere. Jefferson went to William and Mary. Maybe that was it.
Yeah. Well, no, so you get some of the, on the firebrand end, you probably get some people like maybe a Sam Adams or even a John Jay. John Jay was very devout. But that's actually a nice range you just described there, and I think that's right. Now, one comment I would make about that, even if you think of Tom Paine and something like Common Sense, Tom Paine gets more open and more radical later. He eventually, essentially joins the French Revolution. But even in Common Sense, which is his most influential public document, he speaks in biblical language. That is, even those among them that are less what we would call church or formally religious are still speaking in theistic and theological terms that speak to the vast majority of the American people. And the vast majority of the American people are what I would call kind of mainstream religious. You think of the effects of the Great Awakening, for instance, prior to the American Revolution. By the time you get to 1775, 1776, some estimates are that the church-going population is 75, 80% weekly churchgoers. And
we're glad about that. Don't go anywhere, America. More with Matt Spalding on this most important. We've begun the 250th birthday party. It's already begun. So we're going to talk some more about it with Matt Spalding after the break. Go nowhere. Hillsdale Dialogues are all at Hugh4Hillsdale.com.
It's no secret that Americans are more divided than ever. And it's not just over what policies will improve our great country. No, it's over whether America is great at all, whether America deserves our love. That's why Imprimis is so important. Imprimis looks at the issues of the day from a constitutional perspective, reminding citizens always of our great heritage of liberty. For more than 50 years, Imprimis has featured speeches from the smartest conservative thinkers and writers at Hillsdale events. These days, Hillsdale publishes people like Molly Hemingway, Andy Puzder, Harmeet Dillon, and Chris Rufo. Over 6.4 million American households and businesses receive Imprimis absolutely free. And I urge you to sign up for it today at no charge. To get your free lifetime subscription, go to hillsdale.edu/lifetime right now.
Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Hillsdale Dialogue underway with Dean Matt Spalding. All things Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu. All the prior dialogues are at Hugh4Hillsdale.com. We're talking about the Great Awakening. You know, I'm a Catholic. The Catholics are in on the deal, too, because John Carroll is the first bishop of America. His brother, Charles Carroll, signs the Declaration as the largest landowner in the colonies at the time of the Revolution, so they have a lot to lose. But it's ecumenical, it's across the board, and they all have something of the civic religion in them because they all know their Roman and Greek history.
That's correct. And again, that's why the coming together of all these things, that's the real miracle, if you will, of the founding. The providential thing is this wonderful combination of religious. Remember, a lot of them are escaping these religious wars in Europe to come to the colonies to start their own congregations. You get the fact that they've been isolated from the British, as Burke would say, through benign neglect. So they're learning how to govern themselves through their own legislatures. But you also get the fact that they are shaped by British history, which means for all practical purposes, a classical form of education that comes over and then dominates the early curriculum throughout the country, not only in college, but in terms of pre-college as well. They're learning Greek and Roman. The combination of those things create this circumstance, which is the thing that John Adams broadly is saying, that's the real American Revolution. Once that takes hold, once that understanding of the combination of those things takes hold, that's what makes and defines this American people. And one thing that's defining that American people as is, yes, they're British by kinship, but they're not British by political institutions or by their outlook about how they ought to govern themselves.
So, Matt, what is if that's all the black powder lying around, if that accumulates over 200 years from the founding of Virginia and then Massachusetts through the 2 centuries of colonial development and one war, the French and Indian War, which is in the 1760s, what is the spark in 1774 or 5 that leads to the shot heard around the world at Lexington and Concord?
Yeah, so there's a series of taxes, and they eventually kind of withdraw, and they keep coming back because they think Parliament ought to rule, and they eventually are left with the tea tax, the one that they want to keep this tax in principle. That, of course, among other things, leads to the bunch of the sons of the American Revolution, or what do they call the Sam Adams group?
Sons of Liberty, right?
Dumps a bunch of tea in the harbor. Sons of Liberty. There you go. Thank you. And that makes the British mad. And so Parliament passes a whole series of things called the Coercive Acts. They shut down the Boston port. They do all sorts of things. But they eventually pull back on a lot of those things too. But the one thing that really keys them is the Tea Act of 1773. Essentially creates a monopoly over tea, and this is kind of the spark that causes them to dump the tea in the harbor, because they think it's a trick to get them to pay the tax. Once they dump the tea in the harbor, the Parliament passes a lot of things like closing the port and punishing Massachusetts. They decide to come together again for another Congress, which is from the Latin meaning to gather, for legislative purposes, and they do something called the First Continental Congress. And it's after that First Continental Congress, we can come back to that as well, but after that First Continental Congress, once they do 2 or 3 very important things, and the king decides this has gone too far. We need to enforce our laws, and this is what I was alluding to earlier, was at that point the king becomes the enforcer. And it's through the king that they send secret instructions to General Gage in January of 75, which ultimately led to Lexington and Concord.
Now, General Gage is not a villain. And he's kind of sympathetic to us, but he does work for the king. And when he gets his instructions, the militia are not without alert that he's planning something. And there are a variety of conflicts leading up to this. But when he gets the instructions, how does a militia operate? Because it really did happen that way. I took my grandkids to walk the Freedom Trail in Boston, and we stopped by Old North Church. And, that there's a lot of myth, but there's a lot of factual history. And we know the revolution pretty well.
No, that's right. And it's actually a great story. And it actually tells them of the development of our own political character that's important. But you're right in mentioning the Gage, General Gage. He didn't actually want to enforce these things. He thought there was a way to reconcile this and solve this problem, and wanted to find a way out. But he works for the king. He's received his instructions. He sets in motion and wants to send British regulars out to Concord, where there are reports of caches being held there. But one of the beautiful things about the American Revolution is a lot of this stems from various counties and local commissions and things like that have been created, among other things, by the First Continental Congress. And they're really running things. And this is especially true in the North, and it's especially true in Massachusetts. And each county has its own militia, which they're called Minutemen, in the sense that they can kind of roust out and be ready to go. They have their own weapons, many of them left over the French Indian War, so they're very unprepared in that sense. But they start training, they start getting together, and they've been doing this for about a year or so. And they're everywhere, all throughout the countryside around Boston.
Pause right there. Dean Spalding will be right back. Welcome back, America, to the Hillsdale Dialogue. Every last radio and television hour of the week, whether you're watching on the Salem News Channel or listening on the Salem Radio Network, is the Hillsdale Dialogue. Today, Dean Matt Spalding joins me for part 2 of our commemoration of the 250th beginning of the American Revolution in Lexington and Concord. And we were talking about Boston, Dean Spalding.
So the British have been occupying Boston for some time after the Coercive Acts, after the Boston Tea Party. Gage has received his instructions. He's going to send regulars out. Well, some of the things he didn't account for or wasn't aware of, and there's some things we don't exactly know some of the particular history, but there's some evidence that suggests that his wife was sympathetic to the American cause and was actually feeding them information. So there's regularly some things being given away from him. But the thing you alluded to the most is that these county militias had organized a way of communicating, these committees of correspondence. And so they were watching, and they knew something was brewing and potentially happening. And so we all know the story of Paul Revere, this writer who goes out to war in the countryside. But what we don't realize is it's much more extensive and much more complicated. Revere was one of probably a dozen or so writers that night. And there were probably others involved. It was actually a very complicated, extensive network. The British were on ships, so they had to take their ships to ground, and then from ground decide how they would go. Would they, go across the harbor and go directly, or would they go over, take a bridge and go around the other way? Hence, they had to have a signaling process, which is what the Old North Church is. One if by land, two if by sea. They were signaled that they were coming across the harbor, so too. And that sent Revere and others out along the main road, which goes through Lexington towards Concord, and they're going out and they're warning everybody. So they were all pre-warned. And indeed, the cache in Concord had long before been moved. They found a few things here and there, but the main arms they were looking for were nowhere to be found. It also meant they were ready. And they didn't confront them, but when the British Gage sends about, I think, 700 or so regulars and some grenadiers, some of his best trained men out on this mission. They come to Lexington. There's a green there, and lo and behold, the local militia, about 70 people, had gathered on the green. They weren't blocking the roadway. They weren't preventing the British from going along their way to Concord. But that led to the first confrontation where the first shots are fired.
Now, I do want to point out, because I do it every year in con law, we've had in the last 25 years the decision in Heller, the decision in McDonald in Chicago. We've had the decision in Bruin, and now the decision in Rahimi. 4 Second Amendment cases, all trying to explain what is quite obvious. The Second Amendment is premised on there being a local militia, but not conditioned. The right to own weapons is not conditioned on there being a They're all shooters because they're all living on the frontier. They've all got to eat game, and weaponry is just a part of the living room furniture. And it's usually loaded, and the kids don't blow their feet off because they know they're weapons, and they're taught early how to use them. So when they run in, when the British Redcoats arrive, with the Grenadiers or without, they're facing an armed resistance. And that is so deeply ingrained in the American psyche that I doubt there will ever be a comprehensive and successful voluntary return of weaponry from the citizenry to the government. You agree with me on that, Matt?
No, you're absolutely right about that. And that's exactly where that sentiment comes from. Indeed, I'm struck by, as through these various things we've been discussing and more things, a lot of these early British things they did, what ends up in the Bill of Rights, what ends up in the Constitution, the particulars in the Declaration that go into the Constitution, it really does come directly from these things. The Second Amendment grows precisely out of this series of events. The American Revolution would not have occurred had the American colonists not had their own weapons such that they could have militias.
And so pause right there, because we want to come back to the Second Amendment. Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt, joined by Dean Matt Spalding as the Hillsdale Dialogue this week. It's about the battles in Lexington and Concord, which kicked off the American Revolution 250 years and a week ago. Dean Spalding, we're talking about what the British strategy was that fateful morning.
What the British are trying to do is essentially out and get caches, which meant caches of weapons and cannons, larger munitions. And the king, I think it's in early 75 maybe or so, but once this gets going, one of the proclamations he sends out before the Proclamation of Rebellion is to stop all traffic, meaning all trade, England to the colonies, colonies out, a blockade of all weaponry, all munitions, all gunpowder, all firearms of any sort. So they try to shut all that down. But it's the spirit of the revolution in terms of its ideology, its ideas about consent. But the fact that it occurred is not because it's a bunch of Lockean abstract theory. It's because it was understood in a common sense way, an aspect of the American mind, as Jefferson says, by the common American who was literate and well-read, knew their history, knew the history of tyranny, knew the history of religious tyranny as well, and knew that ultimately if they wanted to defend their homes and their property, they had to do it themselves.
Yeah, in this modern world, we have the term respect. We hear it tossed around all the time. The colonists expected reciprocal respect with their British cousins, many of whom they saw somewhat infrequently, but it's a 3 or 4 week voyage, and they were expecting respect from Parliament, a respect that was not given. I'll add to what Matt also said. Our Third Amendment in the Bill of Rights is about quartering. It's the only amendment that has not been considered for at least partial incorporation into the state amendments via that process, because we don't quarter troops on anyone before, but British troops have been quartered upon the people of Boston for some time after the Tea Party. And so like you say, the Second Amendment goes back to this early American history. So does the Third. So does the First, because we're a pamphleteering people and we are a religious people. It's all connected.
Right.
And that's why
everything about jury rights, everything about due process goes back to the American Revolution, which in turn goes back to Magna Carta. It's very clear once you start lining it all up. But how did it get there? How did you get, so too often we sometimes think that, a bunch of these guys who are really smart and read a bunch of things, they wrote a declaration, and then there's this little thing called a war, and then they got together and in secret wrote a constitution, and there you have it. What we don't quite realize.
But tell me
why it's great to tell you this history is precisely because it's through the historical process of real people exercising these rights, being oppressed, and acting as citizens that brings these things to life.
Now, I had Wilfred McClay on a couple of months ago to talk about Land of Hope, and he says he's an objective but not a neutral observer of these facts. After your lifelong study of the events of the founding, Matt, and you were the executive director of the 1776 Commission, I imagine you'll have quite a lot of role to play in the upcoming bicentennial or biquincentennial, our 250th.
Biquincentennial.
You'll have quite a lot to do with our 250th. What do you think is the most important thing for people to remember in the course of this year and a half about the revolutionary struggle?
I'd probably say there are a couple of things. One has to do with what we were already talking about here, which is self-government. I think we don't realize the extent to which the American Revolution is about self-government, governing the self. We can govern ourselves. We're capable of it. We design institutions that allow us to do so, and we look at everything in that perspective. The other thing, which we haven't alluded to, and perhaps we can, in a future episode, especially once we get closer to some of the documents leading up to the Declaration and things like that. The other thing that's probably the most important, broader concept to think about, which I think most Americans understand in their bones, is that the American Revolution is one reason why it's exceptional, is that it's a attempt, an experiment to try to find another way of governing ourselves through a mechanism which is not based on the rule of force. It's not based on kings. It's not based on aristocrats. It's based on self-government, which means we have to understand ourselves to be equal. And ultimately, equal means we have to have a moral understanding of our common humanity. There is a deep philosophical and religious, theistic understanding of our rights that was really in the blood, the blood and the bones of the American revolutionaries. And they understood it deeply. And it goes back to our conversation we've just had about the role of sermons and preachers combined with studies of history of Greek and Romans and the circumstances at hand and British oppression, all of that. But sometimes we cut off the top, if you will. We don't fully comprehend the larger divine, if you will, the theological meanings of our own founding. So I would say the two most
one
important
last
things
question, Matt. What does the average colonist believe a citizen's obligation are? Because this is about citizenship, and some of that is theocratic, some of that is Roman Republic, some of that is Greek. But what is the common understanding of the duty of a citizen?
I think you're absolutely right. So the shift here goes, they somehow become a people. They become a people who want to be a free people. They are people who are equal and want to rule themselves. And eventually this becomes understanding themselves, as it says in the Declaration, by the way, are fellow citizens.
Fellow citizens, indeed. I love doing this. I could do this all year long. And we're going to be doing it for the next year and a half because Dr. Larry Arnn, Dean Matt Spalding, all of the Hillsdale community are going to be deeply involved with our nation's 250th birthday celebration, as they should, since they are the keeper of the flame. That's where the Lantern of the North, Hillsdale College. All things Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu.
Hey there. Today, I want to tell you about the Hillsdale K-12 Classical Education Podcast. This unique show explains how children benefit from an American classical education. Whether you're a teacher, student, or parent, you'll find something of value on the show. You'll hear from teachers and administrators from schools around the country, as well as Hillsdale professors and friends who are leading the effort to revive the American tradition of K-12 education. When you listen, you'll learn all about classical education, what it is, how to teach it, and why it matters today. And there are dozens of back episodes on specific topics, like teaching Singapore math, reading great books, and even understanding how athletics is critical to a child's development. Listen every Monday on podcast.hillsdale.edu. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio.
Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. The Hillsdale Dialogue is underway. All things Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu. All of our prior dialogues, including part one of this conversation with Dean Matt Spalding about the beginning of the American Revolution, can be found at hugh4hillsdale.com. Dean Spalding, we're talking about the key word citizen.
All the things you mentioned go into this, but the overriding aspect is that we are fellow citizens because we can individually rule ourselves. We're created in the image of God. We can rule ourselves under the rule of the law, which means constitutionalism, and that constitutionalism coincident in agreement with kind of a natural law understanding of the nature of things holds us to be equal. So one of the most important aspects of citizenship is this understanding of our equal humanity, but an equal humanity shared by our brethren, our fellow people we have worked with, our community, our neighbors, those we have suffered with, those we are willing to fight for. At the end of the day, the American Revolution and citizenship, we can think about it in civic terms, constitutional terms, but let's not forget patriotism, at the end of the day, is a form of love. And it's a love for your fellow man, your fellow citizen. But why do we love each other? I have a lot of annoying neighbors I don't like that much, but they're still my fellow citizens. It's because we have some common purpose, something to which we are dedicated. And that thing we're dedicated to is going to become clear over the course of these events we're going to be commemorating as they move from being separate British subjects, loyal to the king, and they eventually become understanding themselves as a people, as their own brethren, as friends in terms of civic friendship, and fellow citizens. And that, ultimately, the American Revolution.
A quick exit question. Of the books that they had read in common when the shots rang out in Lexington and Concord, what matters most? It's not Adam Smith. He doesn't write it for another year. Who is it?
In terms of books, that's a hard one to say. Probably the most dominant book is actually the Bible. I always point out there are various studies about quotes throughout all the pamphlets of the American Revolution. They're all overwhelmingly biblical quotes. Locke and other thinkers, Blackstone, come farther down the line. The other thing, going back to your point about education, Hugh, is it might well be Cicero, because everyone reads Cicero because Cicero is the way you learn Latin in the 18th century. So it goes back to these older things. It's not like today where there's some dominant current political treatise they all read, and something like Common Sense then kind of lit that fuse. But it's these deeper things that shape them and form them so that they were ready. They were ready to become Americans. De Republica, Cicero, the greatest lawgiver of them all. Matthew Spalding, Dean Spalding, thank you for parts 1 and 2 of our long march for the next 15 months until we come to July 4th of 2026 and our Quinn Bicentennial, the 250th. Dean Spalding will be back periodically throughout that long march through American history. Thank you, Dean Spalding. Have a great weekend inside the Beltway.
Thanks for listening to the Hillsdale Dialogues, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio. For more information about Hillsdale College, head to hillsdale.edu.